G'day everyone, and welcome to another episode of Lead on Purpose. My name's James Middleton, and for the past 20 years, I've led teams of all shapes and sizes, from the Australian Air Force through to the private sector. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Charles Weller. Charles is a former Australian Army commander who has led in peacetime, combat, and humanitarian assistance operational environments. Charles is also a leading voice of ethical leadership, particularly in the military context. Leveraging his decades of experience, Charles teaches ethical leadership to Australian Defence Force and coalition partner leaders. We discuss what ethical leadership really is and how it's far more than a buzzword or a philosophical topic. So, let's get into it. G'day Charles, how are you today, mate?
James, I'm very well, thank you. Yourself?
I'm great, mate. Thank you very much. It's been a busy start to the week, but a lot of good things happening. So thanks for joining me on here on Lead on Purpose today. For everyone out there, can you just introduce yourself and give us a quick Soldier's 5 on your career and leadership experience today?
Yeah, thanks, James. My career in the has predominantly been in uniform. I was reflecting on this recently. I started off as a private soldier, albeit in the reserve while I was at university, before subsequently joining the army, going through Duntroon, commissioning, and I spent 30 years full time. And I feel fortunate that I was able to have, approximately 10 or so years of that involved in developing leaders, and the other 20 in practicing leadership in the broadest sense, including opportunities to command at all levels, including command on operations overseas, where I was in South Sudan with a group of 30 odd Australians for the better part of a year, while also teams from 5 through to over 500 people, and in the face of complex challenges which many people face, and throughout that it's been the case of learning at each level and with each challenge, making mistakes, and I hope learning from those mistakes to then make some new ones as you face different challenges. And I think that's one of the aspects that I find fascinating about leadership, is that human dimension, because it is a very much a human practice. As I think it was Norman Schwarzkopf said, you lead people. Go down to the motor pool, he said, and try and tell a truck or an armored personnel carrier to do something. It doesn't do anything, but you can ask people, tell people, and have them tell you. So it's very much a human sport, a contact sport that involves people and yourself operating at your best, and at other times, and probably the more challenging aspect is when you're not operating at the top of your game, and yet you still have to be showing up and still have to be providing that leadership. Or, as we all do, and this is one of the areas I find finding increasingly interesting, is the idea of followership. Because whilst my career sounds like I've spent a lot of time in leadership positions, and I've been fortunate to do so at each stage, and in every position I've been, I've also been a follower. And it's that dynamic between the leader and the follower that I find fascinating, as well as leadership upwards, which is something we might like to touch on. So yes, so that gives you a little bit of an overview. Since leaving full-time service, I spent 2.5 years working with Deloitte. And again, that reinforced for me that whilst you adapt your leadership to the circumstances in which you find yourself, that the tenets of leadership that I was taught at Duntroon and applied throughout my career apply maybe not equally in some different ways, but those tenets, the principles of good leadership, are exactly the same whether you are in uniform or out of uniform, whether you're working in a government practice or you're working in a corporate for-profit. Those principles tweaked and applied to the circumstances within which you find yourself work equally well. That was maybe not a revelation, something perhaps I hoped would be the case, but certainly the leadership good leadership that I received and that led me, as well as hopefully the leadership that I provided to those who worked with and for me, was based on that experience over those years in the Army, applying those principles.
I really like that. I think it's sometimes people can get a bit lost in the noise when they think, oh, there's military leadership and then there's corporate leadership or sporting team leadership. But at the heart of it, leadership is leadership. The behaviors that set you up for success, the disciplined behaviors, the self-reflection, the way we manage our emotions and our ego to influence people, is similar across the board, or you could even say it's the same across the board. What leads you to success in one area should lead you to success in others. It's the nuances and the context that change. So I want to go back to we'll go back to the start, because I like what you said about your career almost being broken into two halves, where 20 years practicing leadership and 20 years teaching new leaders. What was that experience like when you were instructing the new crop of Army officers at Duntroon?
Look, I found that a deeply rewarding posting. I think there are a number of aspects. Firstly, that you get to see in the 18 months that you had those who came directly to Duntroon, or the 12 months for those advocates who came across and did the 12 months before graduation, extraordinary change across the board. I'm a firm believer, and certainly felt it myself, that time at Duntroon is transformative in many respects. And that the person who arrives at Duntroon, they leave a different person at the end on graduation. And the central theme I've thought with Duntroon is around leadership. We will forgive people, a lack of knowledge in certain areas, but we won't forgive them an inability or an unwillingness to learn. I had the great pleasure as well, James, of being involved in selection boards for people either going to Duntroon or to ADFA to become Army officers. And my basic foundational assessment was, did they have some energy and enthusiasm and a desire to lead? Do they show just a modicum of potential? Because I'm firmly of the belief that while there are some people who are natural leaders, the vast majority of us, it's a learned skill and practice. Something that if we desire it, we can fill in the blanks, we can demonstrate our experience, or we can be given experiences which build a leader, as well as understanding the principles behind it. So watching young men and women go through, demanding physical exercises out in the field in particular, but also the various activities back in barracks, and seeing their leadership develop, and for some, seeing the penny drop. I do recall, one cadet in particular who perhaps had been struggling, certainly hadn't felt that they were hitting the mark in my conversations with them. Almost have a revelation. You could almost say it was an epiphany where in a deep, dark night, constructing field defenses with others, they found their voice, and they were able to, if you like, impose their requirements on others, even though they didn't have rank, and get the job done. And the change in that individual from there on was remarkable. They have since gone on and had a wonderful career. They're still serving, but they've made brigadier or one-star officer, and I sort of felt very privileged to be there at that moment. I still can recollect it like it was yesterday, and watching them suddenly go, I can do this. So that experience at Duntroon, both teaching the theory and offering them practical experience and opportunities to develop and practice leadership, was wonderful. It was also a great opportunity to go back and revise all the theory and the practice yourself. There's nothing quite like having to teach others to force you to go through and have a fulsome knowledge of that which you are trying to teach.
Oh, that's absolutely true. I think sometimes the biggest lessons we learn about ourselves is when we're trying to explain something to someone else. Because if you can't explain it yourself, well, then it's likely you don't understand it well enough. So what did that experience of things like that, that epiphany, that moment of epiphany for that young officer cadet, what did those sort of things teach you about yourself as a leader?
Oh, that's an interesting question, James. What did it teach me? I think it reinforced to me that the approach that was taken served me well, and that it gave you the foundational knowledge and the tools that when we ask these young men and women, generally speaking, although these days we are the aperture from an age perspective has opened right up, but predominantly they are young men and women. They're usually less than 30. When they go out to take over their troop, as I did, you have anywhere from sort of 15 to 55 soldiers who you are their leader, that you have been given a solid foundation and the ability to lead. There's a great line, and as an Army guy, I'm sort of declaring my hand here with the Navy, the old Navy leadership ethic, where they use this line, and I think it's equally applicable outside of the military. If you substitute instead of command, you can put authority or management authority or the like. Because thinking about leadership often as not, we are in positions where there is a degree of authority, whether it's implicit or explicit, doesn't really matter. Where the Navy leadership ethic talks about leadership amplifying command or leadership amplifying authority. I look at the military, and in particular, yes, it's hierarchical, but there is an expectation of not just direction, grounded in the fact that you have rank, but there is an expectation of good leadership as well, of that extra part. So I think that that opportunity sort of made me sit back and reflect that you are well prepared. You are given every opportunity. It's a matter of you taking the opportunity when it's presented.
I think that's a wonderful sentiment that that leadership amplifies command. I know my experience is that sometimes people in positions of authority or positions of rank in the military can get it the other way around, where command or rank amplifies their leadership, but that's really not the case. It is the leadership component, or all those things, or all those techniques, those skills, those behaviors that allow an individual to influence a situation, whether it be people, whether it be an outcome, whether it be the environment around them, without relying on the given authority of a rank or a title. And that can sometimes be really, really challenging to decouple those two things because they are quite different. So as you went through your career, and my apologies if I'm getting the timing here wrong, you mentioned before that you had a deployment to South Sudan. Now, I did a research project when I was at university on the civil war in Sudan, and there is infinite ethical challenges at play there. So many interconnecting forces. Can you talk me through that experience through your eyes as a military leader in that circumstance, and how that might have shaped your onwards journey into what you're doing today?
James, I was fortunate enough during 2014 and 2015 to be the commander of the Australian contingent. So I had two roles in that regard. Firstly, for the 30-odd Australians who were serving with the United Nations, I was the commander, and I had that Australian command authority and responsibility. I was also the senior military liaison officer for one of the provinces in South Sudan called Jonglei, which was at that stage, and I think remains to this day, what we called a red state. So the civil war in South Sudan was active in that area. The role that we as military liaison officers conducted was unarmed. So while it was a Chapter 7, which means all forms of force necessary could be used to achieve the mission's mandate, and many of the forces, the uniformed forces, were armed, we were not. We were designed to be a liaison element, and by being unarmed, the theory was that we were therefore not threatening to the various parties, and so could be the liaison between them, provide a communications conduit between warring factions, the UN, and the government forces, local authorities, whether they be government or opposition, to facilitate UN operations. Now, in practice, at times, that meant that we were sent into areas that were actively involved in fighting, and often sent there without necessarily the forces to provide us with protection, being protected by the UN flag. So there was a risk that you had to take, usually on behalf of others, or made decisions where you would at times have to push back against the UN command to say, no, I think that is unsafe for the people that we're going without a significant force going with them. I had, I think, if I remember correctly, varying between 30 to about 35 other liaison officers within my unit, and somewhere between 19 to 22, it varied a bit, different nationalities. So it provided you with an interesting mixture of people, of backgrounds, of experiences, leavened, if you would like, by the UN, but those different cultures, those different approaches, certainly at times came to the fore. I think often the greater ethical challenges I found in that role were within the UN, between the various, one tends to view at times the UN as being the UN. Well, there's varied and many different elements to the UN. And there were some particular organizational structures where you had the element within UNMISS, the United Nations mission in South Sudan, that held most of the administrative and logistical elements, which was under civilian control. And then you had the force, which was under military control with a 3-star Ethiopian general. And at times you needed those two to work together to achieve an operational effect, which sounds simple, and we were just talking about collaboration and coordination. But I tell you, at times it was pure conflict, and it was competition, because the different parts of the organization had different goals, and you were trying to achieve an effect on the ground, and there was internal as well as, back in New York, politics being played out. So trying to square that circle was at times very challenging. There was also some ethical challenges, or I certainly felt that there were ethical challenges in the way that the UN was employing, even one could say to some degree, exploiting what were called UN volunteers. Now, these were people who were basically paid a stipend. They were not part of the permanent UN, they were not under permanent UN employment, and they were being used in a way where it was kind of like they were under probation, and their hope for many of them was that by serving as a volunteer, they would win themselves a permanent UN position. And I found some of the ways that they were being treated were particularly challenging. And that put me at odds on occasions with the UN chain of command, not so much within the military, but within the civilian side. So look, there were plenty of challenges, but it was a wonderful experience in an organisation that was being seriously tested by both the circumstances and its structure.
That is absolutely fascinating that there are, even within the UN, because I think we can see that there is often this, the UN is doing one thing, maybe another country is doing another thing, but even UN to UN, there's different elements you talk about there between the civilian side and then the military side with the 3-star Ethiopian general. And there's out and out conflict, I think you said there. And that fascinates me, because I would assume that everyone should understand why they're there. Everyone should understand what this uniting purpose or this greater good is that we're serving there. So how did you see, or how did your role manifest in all that? You know, you are a military leader, you're a senior officer in the Australian Defence Force, you're deployed with the UN, but you're kind of in the middle of all this. So what did that look like for you?
Well, look, James, I took the approach of, I'm here to try and make things better. I was fortunate to be serving with some, exceptionally talented, energetic, and professional officers within my organisation. There was a Kiwi who was an absolute standout. I only had one Aussie in my team, but a Kenyan OPSO for a while there. I had a Swiss OPSO. So, in many respects, the leading of the team, aside from the odd occasion where it felt like I was back being a troop commander and I had one of my, junior lieutenants in front of my desk, it was just the fact that instead of that, I was actually a colonel and he was a lieutenant colonel, and it was one of those that was where authority and command came into play, where it's heels together and I'm telling you exactly what you need to do. But generally speaking, the organisation, that part of the organisation ran itself in no small part, and was a pleasure to be a part of. Where I saw the advantage was that I could assist with the organisation more broadly, both in the area that I was working, which was I was with my team and almost 2,000 others north of the capital Juba in a place called Bor. So we were operating in our own area of operations. But I could look at what can I do to make this better? How can I join up some of these gaps rather than just criticizing or complaining about the situation? Endeavour to use the position that I held and the I guess limited authority, but authority nonetheless that was offered to me to try and stitch things together in a better manner. To try and draw, for instance, we tried to run combined patrols where we would use the UN police force that was in the area as well, because when you went out into the state and you were dealing with areas, at times they've been traumatized by militaries. So turning up as a military member, notwithstanding that we were unarmed, often didn't elicit the same kind of response as a police officer. I always tried to make sure that there was wherever possible, a gender balance in the patrols that we would send out, or the patrols that I would accompany, because you would gain access to and information from and engage with the women in the community. And look, it's at times, and this may be sort of challenging for people in Australia, but it was quite a chauvinistic society, and there would be lots of front from the men around, well, we can demonstrate that we don't need anything and we're tough, whereas you would then get a different perspective from the women in the patrol who would be able to engage with the women in the community. So little things like that. The challenges within the UN at times were we constructed if you like, a campaign plan to get into the north of the state where the UN had not sent forces for quite some time. So we were basically blind. And what we were looking to try and do was to understand what the opposition were doing so that we could circumvent or forestall, further fighting, so that we could, if you like, give peace a chance. And to do that, you need to understand what both parties are doing. One of the challenges was that during the wet season in South Sudan, you are basically immobile from a road perspective. The 200 kilometres I mentioned back to Juba would be impassable for weeks, if not months. So you needed helicopter support. And the helicopters were held not within the force, but within the civilian side of the organisation. So we put in a series of requests for air mobile support and started winning those because we were justifying what we were doing. And about 6 weeks into this campaign, that unfortunately came to a crashing halt because the idea of equity across all the states came into play. And they were saying, hang on, Zhonglei's getting all of these aircraft and all of these sorties, and that's unfair. My argument back was, yes, but Zhongli is actually then providing you with information about what is happening in the north of the state, and that is opening our eyes to understand what the opposition is doing, which will have a major effect on our ability to prevent further conflict. Unfortunately, after a week or so later, my argument didn't hold sway, and the politics of equity came back into play, which was very frustrating, but that's part of operating within the UN, that it's understanding the context, James, I think is one of those key aspects. As a leader, it takes time to genuinely understand what is going on. And that, the organizational charts that we often refer to are merely at best a snapshot of a moment in time. And at worst, they can be totally misleading because people who hold power, whether that is authority or in particular money and resources, aren't necessarily reflected by being at the top of the tree. And you have to work that out.
Absolutely. I think there's a couple of really good lessons in there that I think for any leader. And one of those there is that, well, you're not always going to get what you want. You're not always going to get what you ask for yourself, for your team, but understanding how those resources or that support is going to help you towards your end goal is really, really important, because then you can at least justify it. You can at least prioritize things, have a discussion. The other one, which I think is so, so important especially for brand new leaders, people stepping into a formal leadership role for the first time. But it's probably equally as applicable to experienced CEOs of large companies, is in the world of infinite complexity, when there are 1,001 moving parts and you find yourself in the middle of it, distilling what you need to do down to just make things a little better can get you going in that right direction. What better looks like is going to depend on whether you're like you were in Sudan on a UN mission, whether it's going to be in another military conflict zone, or in a large company like when you worked for Deloitte, or in small business. All of these environments have a huge amount of complexity, and you're not going to understand everything. But if you can take that as like, I know where I want to go, I know what the greater purpose is that I'm trying to lead towards, so let me just try and make things a little better. Is that something that stuck with you as you sort of finished out your military career and went into the corporate world?
Absolutely. I think it reminds me of the relationship between strategy and leadership, in that the difference between a strategy and a plan, to my mind, is that a strategy is overarching. It sets the direction, the tone. It looks probably well into the future, and then the path that you lead to get to that is not straight and inexorably going to lead to that. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step to the side, sometimes a step back. and that you have to be prepared that you won't always get it right. You'll get it somewhat right at times. Sometimes you will get it wrong. And as a leader, you need to be able to accept that, to reflect on that, and to understand how do you have the resilience to bounce back and the adaptability to change sufficiently to continue on that path towards that goal. And that it is nothing to my mind in either life, business, or your professional life is dictated as being smooth, clear, and easy. If anything, it's often the opposite. I can't remember exactly the Churchill quote, but he had a good one, something about the ability to go from failure to failure without dulling your energy or some such. And I think that's important, that we as leaders don't stumble at the first hurdle and then lie there. You have to pick yourself back up. There's certainly a Japanese proverb of knock down 6 times, get up 7. You learn from those missteps, or certainly I have, and I've made plenty of them, and hopefully I've learned from most of them, not all of them, I'm sure. But you take that back into the way that you approach it. It's not about not making mistakes. Hopefully it's about not making the same mistakes twice or 3 times over, because then you're setting a pattern of behavior that might indicate you're not learning from your experience. But I think you have to have that, that goal, that purpose, and then understand that all of the challenges in between, the steps that you have to take, the plans that you put in place, will little by little lead you towards that. But it doesn't mean that you will be taking giant steps all the time. We learn by doing, and we often learn, or certainly I have, as much from the missteps and the mistakes as you do from the successes. I've often thought, I don't know if this might resonate with you, that leadership starts happening when you have to say no for the first time. It's very easy when everything's going smoothly, when you've got all the resources under the stars. The path is clear. In fact, it's being cleared for you, and you're moving towards it. Leadership becomes even more important when resources are constrained, and you have to tell people that, no, we won't be doing this or that, or you can't have those resources because we need to focus our endeavors over here. And the challenge for the leader in that regard is to ensure that those people understand what's going on, see the purpose in what you are doing and the reason that they need to take a backward step, and then willingly engage with whatever else needs to be done. If leadership was easy, everyone would do it and would do it perfectly, but it isn't. I think leadership is challenging, can be hard at times, but is absolutely necessary.
Absolutely. That the first time that leadership can be easy when it's easy to keep everyone happy. You've got an abundance of resources, time, money, whatever it might be. Everyone's heading in the same direction. There's no competing priorities. Everything's going smoothly. That's easy. That challenge, that first time that you realize as a leader that saying no to someone is going to affect them emotionally, is going to affect their team emotionally. When that happens, when you no longer can keep everyone happy, that's when we risk fear and ego starting to drive the leadership bus. And we can start to fall into that trap of making those decisions based on, I'm afraid that person won't like me if I don't appease them. That's probably not your best decision. Or, no, I don't care what that person has to say. I'm right, they're wrong. Well, that's probably not your best decision either. There's your fear and ego coming into play. So that challenge for leadership in those moments is to, when stuff starts to go wrong, when we're challenged, is to regulate that fear and ego, understand how they are influencing our ability to lead, and then make a decision. Because that's when we start to move towards that greater good. That's when we start to really act ethically in leadership.
Yeah, look, I like that. I like that difference between fear and ego. I think that's really well expressed, James. I think it, to my mind, it then springs back to Aristotle and the golden mean. It's finding that sweet spot between those two, which isn't easy to do. But it's if you're telling someone no, you don't want to be arbitrary and directive unless you absolutely have to. But neither do you want to then make a poor or wrong decision because you're concerned of their reaction. I don't know. There's that sign. There was the sign outside the camp in Kuwait when I used to go through there, as many Australians have before going into Iraq, that said, we need leadership, not likership. It's a horrible term, likership, but I can't think of a better way of expressing it. And that is challenging, particularly I think for junior leaders, on their first foray into leadership. Innately in humans, there's a desire that we don't want to be ostracized. We want to be part of the group. We want to be well accepted. Part of being a leader is putting yourself out there in a position where you will say no to people. You will get them to do and demand of them things that they don't want to do, things that are hard and things that are difficult. The acme of leadership is to get people to do things that they don't want doing, that will be hard, and somehow like it. Now, not many of us can get to that stage, but I suspect that the vast majority of leaders can get people to the point where they understand why things are the way they are, and they at least accept it. And that they feel that they've been brought along for the ride rather than just belted back into their box. Neither of which are good places to be. So yes, your fear and ego. I'm going to steal that one. I think that's a great way of viewing it, and finding that golden mean between those two is a useful way of thinking about leading people when you're having to say no.
Absolutely. There's that challenge in leadership between the balance between performance or standards and relationships. And if you start to shift that balance, well, you can't have good relationships, or you can't keep everyone happy all the time. And you're not going to keep everyone happy all the time if you're holding them to account on standards. But if you try to keep them happy all the time, well, then standards start slipping. So it is this balancing act. And I think that is why I firmly believe that some of the hardest leadership roles that people anywhere will come across is when that first promotion to corporal, when you've been one of the crew, one of the group, you've been one of the people, the soldiers doing that work. And then all of a sudden, because of high performance from yourself, you're elevated to your first position of formal leadership. But you've got such close friendship relationships with those people that it can really challenge those young people to make those hard decisions and to address the fear and ego, because it can be seen as putting those personal relationships at risk. And that's where trust comes into it, where we have trust in leadership. We can have those difficult conversations. We can bring people on that journey. We can tell them as much as we can without overstepping, but they trust in us as leaders, or we trust in our leaders, that they are acting and behaving in pursuit of a greater good. They are acting in our best interest, even if they can't tell us exactly why something's going on and we don't necessarily know what that is or like it. That is such a challenge for young leaders.
Yeah, that first step, particularly leading people who you know and those who you've been one of the team, and then suddenly you're elevated to lead the team, is a true test of leadership, but it's also a true test of followership. And I think you find, one would hope that you find, those people who are, have a genuine interest in you and a belief in you, will be the ones who readily become good followers. And I think good followership is something that we don't like. I think that the term, everyone wants to consider themselves to be a leader and to be affecting leadership. We don't focus necessarily in the same way on followership, and that is a testing situation for those followers who now have someone who used to be one of them, if you like, elevated, given some authority, given some rank in a hierarchical organization, or made the foreman, or promoted to manager in a consulting organization, and they're then leading the people who they were at the coalface with, and now their role is slightly different. Maybe that's something I'll tease out a little bit more, is the idea of that role clarity piece, where I think that can really help those leaders, where they clearly understand the role and the difference that their new position entails, as well. Those people who are following have a clear understanding of that difference, so that the distinctions are made and are readily apparent to all those who are involved, and that people have, hopefully as a good follower, you have the sufficient maturity to realise that there will be a bedding in period, and sufficient maturity in the new leader that they will not, as one can see happening, overstep the mark into being, more directive and authoritarian than they need to be in the circumstance, because they're concerned about that leader-follower relationship. It's something, I think, as you grow as a leader, you realise that often as not, you don't have to push very hard on the door for the door to open, because most organisations that I've been a part of, there's pretty good alignment. 90% of the people, 90% of the time, are aligned with the direction of the organisation and the institution, and cobble down and get on with things in that direction, which makes it, both a pleasure to lead, but also a less demanding situation to be in. I think that first step, as you've pointed out, can be really challenging for someone, and often they need that time to settle into it, and hopefully they're settled into it by having good followers. Not always the case, though.
No, it is not always the case. Followership I think is not separate from leadership. That's part of that, having that influence that you want to have as a leader, is being willing to allow someone else to step in and shine if they are best placed to do it. Is about leading upwards, as you talked about it earlier. Leading upwards isn't necessarily telling the person above you on the organisation chart what to do. It's supporting them and influencing outcomes in the direction that we're going. So I want to just to jump forward to what you're doing now, because we talked about it a little bit before we jumped on and hit record. But I can see you spent time as an instructor at Duntroon, training people and teaching people. Those lessons you learnt in that deployment to Sudan, about just trying to make things a little better in the realms of complexity. Can you tell me now how are you making things a little bit better as you're teaching ethics in the command and staff course context?
So, well, I hope I am. It'll be up for others to say, James, if I am. I would like to think that I'm contributing to the next batch of senior and often strategic leaders in getting them to think about some of the more challenging aspects of leading at senior levels. So the senior course at the Defence College, which is for colonels and equivalent and executive level 2, with also a few one-star officers on the course, we look at how do you lead at that next level. So how do you transition from tactical and operational leadership into the strategic realms? What are the specific challenges that they face? Both those ones that are enduring, but also those ones that are contextual. And you mentioned, complexity, and I think, I used to wrestle with this one. I don't know how you think about it, but everyone would say, "Oh, it's the most complex it's ever been," and I'd sort of go, "Well, is that just us of the moment talking up the challenges that we've got, seeing with the benefit of hindsight how things laid out previously. But I do think that, when you consider the speed with which information can travel around the world and the effects thereof, the numbers of connections. You might be familiar with, the anthropologist Dunbar and his number of 150 people, which was sort of the tribe size. Well, within 150 people, you can have 11,175 connections. It's on a power curve from there. If you take 25 million people or so in Australia, potentially there are 312 trillion possible connections. And if you look at our society now with the phone that I'm talking to you with, the smartphone, the connections between people to people and then people to things, we've never had more. So I think this is the environment in which senior leaders are going to be operating with. Technological disruption at a rate we've never seen before, societal change, environmental factors, layered over the top of that, geopolitical uncertainty. So how do they operate in that environment when they become responsible now for the direction of organizations and teams within those organizations? It's a really challenging space to be within. And one of the things that we do is we have them have a look at what it is that they believe ethically at the moment. We offer them some different theories and ways of viewing behaving ethically. We outline some of the challenges, and there are some specific challenges that relate to more senior leaders, as well as the challenges that relate to all of us from an ethical perspective. So all of us are more challenged when we're tired, when we're stressed, when we are fearful, when we feel cognitive overload. So as a senior leader, you are much more likely to feel that last one, that cognitive overload, notwithstanding that you will be more experienced, but the requirements on our senior leaders to absorb information and understand the context have never been greater. And then as a senior leader, there are some challenges that affect them specifically that we make them aware of. We're not saying that this will happen to you. We're saying this might happen to you. As a senior leader within an organization, your power grows, your access to resources and information grows, and you are placed to some degree on a pedestal. And sometimes you can end up believing your own press. And then there are some people who are affected by the idea of, oh, look, I'm working really hard, so I can take a little bit of an advantage here because I'm actually working harder than everyone else, and you can wind up on a slippery slope. So we give them all of those, and then we offer them some ways to respond. And this sits around three main areas, James. One is ethical decision making, and we look at ethical decision making in that complexity. How can they tease out what is the right thing to do when the easy decisions have been made? Those clear-cut, this is right, this is wrong, this is better, this is worse. Generally speaking, when you are a more senior leader, if you've set up your organization well, those easy decisions are made by the people beneath you. They bring you the tough ones. They bring you, hey boss, I've got this really good one for you. I really don't know how to tease this out. And as we were talking about before, that decision to say no to people, you're often looking at a decision where the best outcome you can find is finding the least worst outcome, not a great outcome. It may be around, who are you going to harm because someone's going to get harmed. Someone is not going to win out of this. So we tease them through that. We then offer some ideas around ethical leadership, which is drawing together something I know is near and dear to your heart, the idea of ethics and leading ethically. And we sort of say, look, leading ethically isn't just not leading toxically. It goes beyond that. And to my mind, using the ends, ways, means approach to strategy, it demands of the leader that they look at the ends of their organization and make sure that those are just and fair. the way in which you combine the organizational resources, including your people, are ethical, and that, to go to, to Kant, Immanuel Kant, you never treat your people merely as a means to an end. You remember that they are ends in themselves, even though you will use them to achieve. That's part of the bargain of being part of an organization. You always remember that they are ends in themselves and not just resources to be used up. If I may, one of the things that stuck in my craw when I was with Deloitte, and I have to sort of say for the record, I didn't witness anything that was horribly illegal or unethical while I was there, but I didn't like the way that they called people resources. I thought that was, that set the wrong tone. We spoke about, we're going to resource this project. I'm saying, no, we're going to people it. We're looking at the people we're going to be employing on this project or that project. I think it starts you down the wrong track if you start referring to people just as resources. They're more than that. So we offer that. And then the final thing that we offer to people is the idea of how to build an ethical organization. How to build an organization that isn't just neutral, it inclines towards the ethical, which helps you resist things like ethical drift and normalization of deviance. So look, I'm passionate about it. I think it is a really useful framework, and it gets people thinking about what it is they're going to be doing when they leave this wonderful year that they've been granted to study, but they go into more demanding and more senior positions.
So the way you've talked about that in three distinct areas that flow from one to the next is really, really interesting, because when we talk about building a more ethical organization, not something that's just neutral and, doesn't deliberately harm, that's not what we want in society. And I think the vast majority of organizations would say, yes, of course we want to be more ethical. We want to do the right thing. We want to be seen to be doing the right thing. We want to encourage people to go out of their way to do the right thing. But then starts to ask the question, okay, well, what is the right thing? Which, when we go back in your explanation to those other two components, well, leading ethically, that's you're behaving in a certain way as a leader to enact ethical leadership. But before that, the first thing you talked about was just discussing what it means to be ethical. And that's challenging people to think differently, because without thinking differently, they're not going to shift their behavior. And unless people shift their behavior, the organization won't change. You can put in place as many policies, procedures, checks and balances, or management-y things as you want. But if people are still acting in a way or behaving in a way that serves their best interest rather than the greater good, you're never going to get there. So the way you talk about is starting with, what does it mean to be ethical? It sounds like a simple discussion, but so often it isn't. With the way you teach these things, do you discuss the concept of objective ethics and subjective ethics at all?
So what we do, we're fortunate that we bring Dr. Simon Longstaff from the Ethics Centre in as the start, and he talks about ethics being foundational to culture and choice. He distinguishes between, if you like, morality and ethics in a way I think you're referring to. From my perspective, what I try and do with the team is talk about the difference between your reaction and your response. That we tend to react with an emotion, and we say that's wrong, that's disgusting, that's unfair, without necessarily thinking about it. And that's a real challenge, because that often sets the response that you then take forward, and you've done it almost unthinkingly, on the basis of a reaction. It was Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, spoke about between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space we get to choose our response. I think, to me, being ethical is about using that space, and I think it applies more broadly here, James, to leadership generally speaking. Rarely have I been in a situation where I haven't had at least a moment to think about my response. And I think, from the time that I first was at Duntroon, one of the things that was drummed into all of us was that, as an officer, as a leader, you were expected to stop, think, then act. And that rarely was it a drill. You needed to be the one doing the thinking. You were paid more for your brain than your brawn. And I think that applies, and there's a neat join there between the idea of ethics being a reasoned response, an examined life, and leadership being making an appreciation of the situation and then influencing people towards a collective goal that I think, to my mind, I find, partially satisfying. I don't think it's the whole thing, but it links the two things together in the way that you go about your business, being a leader and hopefully being ethical, that you shift your thinking to something that is considered. And that's where I would say that, subjective objective comes into play. One of the challenges I foresee is the alignment between, if you like, the personal ethics or values that people bring to an organization and the organization's purpose, values, and ethics. And that there needs to be sufficient alignment between those two things. And that some of the real challenges, those ethical dilemmas for people come where there's a tension between them. There's competing priorities, competing values. And that's where you have to really use ethical reasoning in the time that's available to try and forge your path. And that's where I also think that, to your point around building an ethical organization, is you have to, it's essential that you have within your organization ethical leaders who provide the right example, but it's insufficient for you just to rely on that. I think that leaders then have to apply their professional experience and their intellect to look at the way that their organization is structured, it rewards people, it decides on who gets ahead and who doesn't. It enacts the direction of the organization in an objective way that takes into account all the varying factors, so that you don't end up in the situation where you are looking backwards going, oh, how do we miss that policy was going to have unfair outcomes? It's a pre-mortem thing rather than a post-mortem.
Absolutely. And I think I really like what you're saying there, that you have these ethically focused leaders within an organization. And we would hope that every leader at every level has that ethical mindset. And that's what we strive towards, because that then means we don't end up relying on single points of failure or creating dependence on individuals to tell other people what it is to be right or wrong. We need to have absolute clarity around what we, not just me, but what we agree is right, is wrong, and what we're going to do in either case. And it's those then practices and those policies that are informed by this ongoing feedback loop of what is right, what is wrong, what is ethical. Those then policies, procedures, and practices is what sustains the organization beyond individual leaders promoting up or moving on to a new opportunity or handing over the cards to the next generation. That's what makes it sustainable within an organization to be an ethical organization. With all the lessons that you've learned throughout your career, and now I'm sure you're learning day to day as you're teaching on these courses, what is a bit of advice or a bit of something to think about that you would give to leaders coming through, whether it be junior leaders just in their first sort of promotion, or even people moving into executive roles? What's something that you would love them to know to help them make things just a little bit better in their own leadership area of influence?
I think having a clear understanding of how they see leadership is really important. Understanding that, leadership is it's the practice of influencing others through the projection of your personality and character and the application of your professional experience to achieve a goal that you've or your organization has decided upon. But more than that, it's that leadership it's not a finite game. It's an infinite game. It goes on. It is not something that is one and done, set, you're set and forget. As a leader, you will have good days and you will have bad days. And I think the importance of reflecting on your leadership can't be understated because of that reality that leadership is an ongoing dynamic that you don't get right and then it stays right. You'll have days where you're on top of the world where just everything clicks, and then you'll have the very following day you'll be going, I can't seem to put a foot right. I'm not able to easily influence and to achieve the goals that we need to. There's greater levels of friction and conflict. I've had my trusted advisor come in and say to me, "Hey, boss, that's a real misstep if we go down those lines." Whereas yesterday, you will have those ups and downs. Reflection, understanding, being aware of how well or otherwise things are going, but keeping at it. If I can make another Churchill quote, Churchill said, "When you find yourself in hell, keep going." There will be bad days, and as a leader, I think either early in the conversation you spoke about, the ability to regulate yourself. The leader, people want their leaders to be calm, thoughtful, generally speaking, emotionally, regular. They will prefer someone who is consistent, even if they are consistently demanding, over someone who is mercurial and comes in one day and is hail fellow, well met, and the next day is, sort of silent and brooding and the like. Certainly that's my experience, where I would rather have someone who was, a hard-ass, very demanding, but they were consistently that, and you knew what you were getting from your leader, versus someone who was up and down and you thought that they may have a split personality. But to your point, and to distill that one, it's around that idea that leadership. What was it? Woody Allen said, 90% of success is showing up. As a leader, you have to show up day in, day out. No matter how good or bad the day was before, today's the new day. Reflect on it, learn from it. You will get better, and particularly for that new leader. You will grow in your capacity to lead, but you have to get out there and practice it. Practice, practice, practice. I'm still practicing it. I think everyone who's a leader will continue to do that until the day they die. It doesn't stop. It's an infinite game, not a finite game.
And just when you think you might have it right, then something will change. And someone else will be having a bad day. And so what you did the day before where you had a really good positive influence, that's not going to work now because they've got their own stuff going on. And that's a real challenge. I think that I love what you said there about consistency. Consistency one way or another, because at least people know what they're going to get. Ideally, we'd be consistently ethical and regulated and calm and communicate well. And I think for those leaders at every level, we want that consistency, not just at the individual level where we can influence our immediate circle, but consistency of leadership all the way up, down, left and right of an organization. And that means that when an organization has that clearly defined definition or reference for what good, consistent, ethical leadership looks like, it makes it so much easier for the individuals when they're having a bad day to go back to that and go, okay, I'm having a bad day. What do I need to do? I need to put my best foot forward. I need to show up. I need to regulate myself and be considered in what influence I want to have over this situation. And you're still going to have good days or bad days. So before we wrap up, I want to challenge you with a question about one of those bad days. So can you tell me about a time through all of your leadership experience where something wasn't going right, you realized that you were in fact part of the problem, and then what did you do about it?
This is it was over a period of time where I, with the benefit of hindsight, I would have seen the small indication, the little wisps of smoke about something that was going awry. And I sort of really reflected on this in my career, where the confluence of organizational changes to the structure that created a much larger and more demanding element within the artillery regiment that I was leading at the time, where another factor was that we had denuded from operational deployments the middle leadership. What happens when you have a smaller number of leaders leading a much larger organization with over 200 people with significant amounts of equipment is that people will tend to revert to a more authoritarian and directive style. And that was the case. And this was a situation where anonymously letters of complaint were sent to pretty much the defense minister down, and came rocketing into the unit. And I realized that, that with the benefit of hindsight, I could have seen those little indications, or I should have stepped back. And this is probably the thing I learned, James, there was you need to, as the leader, you want to be involved to some degree, but you need to step back and look at the whole. And, one of my mantras to people when they go into senior leadership positions is you need to clearly define what your role is and that which only you can do. Now, that may be because of your position, it may be because of authorities around money or resources or the like, but realize that you need to be looking at the whole. People talk about the helicopter view or the view from the ground, the dance floor or the balcony view, but you need to be looking at the whole of your organization, and you need to be applying your professional acumen and going, where may this go? What might these factors lead to? Because no one else is in a position to do that. Had I done that, perhaps I would have fought the situation before it wound up requiring, external intervention, an inquiry officer from outside being appointed and coming in, and to investigate what had gone on. This poor chap turned up to investigate, and I said, you need to also have a look, not just at this battery, but you need to have a look at everything that my headquarters has done, everything that I have said, everything that I have written, every order that I have signed off, because this is bigger than just the area where, if you like, the fire was. The fire was fed from other aspects. And look, you can put that down to, to a learning experience. But for me, it was, as a more senior leader, you have to look at that confluence of people, structures, organizations, and tasking in a way that no one else can, because they're not in the position that you have been gifted. And it's that ability to step back and the ability to, as a leader, think through how this may transpire into the future. The further on you go as a leader, the further into the future you need to be looking, and the more that you are going to have to trust and delegate the detail to people within your organization so that you can do that which only you can do.
Absolutely. See the whole and delegate the detail. Because if you don't maintain that position where you can, get the proverbial arms around the whole problem, then you're going to miss something, and you can't then have the influence that you want to have. Because if you're right down there in the weeds, you're trying to do things that you don't need to do, but you feel like it will make you feel more important. Well, you're going to be busy doing that while something else is going off the rails.
Absolutely. And that's a real challenge for leaders, particularly if they're promoted within their organization, because we humans have a tendency to revert to the last level that we were comfortable at. And we can see what others are doing in the positions that we've been in and go, oh, well, I wouldn't do it that way. It's a case of someone needs to sort of say, whether it's the individual themselves grabbing themselves or someone else, and this can be the benefit of an external coach or mentor or advisor or trusted person who can come in and say, those days are gone. Those people are doing that for the organization, for the team now. If you're focusing in on that, who's doing your job? Who's fulfilling your responsibilities? And that's particularly hard for people when they first step into that more senior role, or as we were discussing, James, that first appointment leader, where they go, oh, well, I can delve back into the detail because I know I'm good at that. It's like those days are gone. You're now responsible for the whole of the team, not just that bit of shit.
Absolutely. We see this in organizations that are very technically minded, whether it be aviation, engineering, heavy industry, any of those sorts of things. Well, people in those organizations generally get promoted into higher levels of authority because they are technically excellent. And that's where they're comfortable. The leadership stuff can sometimes be seen as a that'll come later, or you'll pick that up naturally, which is just not the case. They're technical experts. Now we need to teach them to be leadership experts, and they need to have that, as you said, that external person come in sometimes and go, hey, you're going well, but let's do it a bit better. Here's the things you're missing. So let's make it better.
And you end up in a position where you are leading experts, not being the expert yourself.
Yeah, and that can be a very uncomfortable position to be in that can be the challenge to the ego, and can have the fear start to bubble up, because if you've always been the expert, but now you're not, that hurts. That gets hard. That absolutely does. Well, mate, we've had a great chat. I could chat for hours and hours and hours. We may have to do a round 2 of this to continue diving down that ethical pathway. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you would like the audience out there to know about what it really means to be an ethical leader?
Look, I think there is both a responsibility to be an ethical leader for the people that you lead, but there is also significant advantage both for the individuals you lead, yourself and your organization, to be ethical. Ethical leadership tends to lead to more productive, happier, more trustworthy teams. So there are significant advantages that accrue. So it's not just sort of, touchy-feely kumbaya type, work. It is work that makes organizations work better. So I think it's the double whammy from my perspective. That said, it's not something that is there is no magic wand. It is harder because you need to be applying yourself to the whole of whatever business you're in or team you are involved in, the processes, the practice, the ends, the people. That means it's going to demand more of the leader, but it's also going to provide more to the team and to the organization. So I think that's the thing I would leave people with, that it's both good for the people, it's good for the organization, and it'll be good for your bottom line.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I absolutely love it, mate. Thank you very much. Well, Charles, thanks for taking the time to chat with me today. It's been an absolutely amazing chat. Good luck with the remainder of your course this week and into next. And we'll have to catch up again soon.
James, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed our conversation. It's been thought-provoking, and I will certainly take away that golden mean between fear and ego from our chat.
Amazing. Thank you very much, mate. I'll chat to you soon.
Cheers, James.